The story of Don Carlos is not one that brings comfort, but one that haunts the edges of history, lingering like the silence in a forgotten tower. He was born in 1545 to King Philip II of Spain, a ruler who held the weight of an empire across Europe and beyond. As the heir to the Spanish throne, Don Carlos should have been raised with honor, respect, and careful guidance. Instead, his life from the beginning was marked by unease. The child was sickly, frail, and prone to wild swings of mood that frightened even the most experienced caretakers. His body was twisted by congenital deformities, his temperament so unpredictable that his tutors often begged to be removed from their posts. While Spain shone like a polished coin under his father's rule, the boy locked in its golden castle was already falling apart. Behind the palace doors, courtiers whispered about the prince's strange behavior. He was known to lash out without warning, herd animals for amusement, and erupt into screaming fits that echoed through stone walls. Servants moved in silence around him, their heads bowed, their eyes averted, as if to avoid the wrath of a young man who wore a crown not yet placed, but already heavy. In 1562, when Carlos was just 17, he suffered a violent fall down a staircase. The incident nearly killed him. Some said it was an accident, others believed it was a result of one of his many outbursts. But when doctors drilled into his skull to save him, something in him changed. He survived physically, but mentally the boy unraveled further. After the fall, Carlos became more volatile. He ranted at shadows, screamed at nothing, and threatened those closest to him. He began to lose touch with reality. His father, King Philip, now ruled not only over Spain, but over a son who was becoming a danger to everyone around him. Spain was locked in religious wars, political alliances, and expansion abroad. There was no room for a mad prince within this fragile balance. Still, for a time, Carlos remained visible in court ceremonies, standing at his father's side dressed in royal garments, but his eyes were restless and his smile thin. It was around this time that Carlos was betrothed to Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess whose marriage was meant to seal peace between Spain and France, but politics took a strange turn. King Philip married Elizabeth himself, making her queen and stepmother to the man she was once promised to. Carlos took this as a betrayal, and it shattered what little emotional stability he had left. His anger toward his father grew into obsession. He began to speak openly of his hatred, plotted against nobles, and even tried to flee the palace in secret. Some reports claim he planned to assassinate his father, seize power, and start a war with Flanders in defiance of royal orders. Whether these claims were real or manipulated by those within the court remains unclear, but they gave King Philip all the reason he needed. In early 1568, the king ordered his son arrested. No public explanation was offered, no trial held. Carlos was taken to his chambers under heavy guard, the door locked, the windows sealed, and no visitors permitted. The boy who had once stood on palace balconies waving at crowds was now a ghost, hidden away from the world. The walls of his prison were bare, the air stale, the meals small and tasteless. Carlos began to decline rapidly. Confined and isolated, he refused food, his body wasting away. He scratched prayers into the stone walls, whispered to himself, and cried out in the night for forgiveness, for freedom. For the mother he barely remembered. Letters from him were found years later, full of desperation, apologies, promises, and pleas for mercy. But no help came. His father had turned the page and left his son to rot. The prince lived like this for 6 long months, slowly fading into shadow, until one summer day in July the guards found him. Motionless, pale eyes wide open, his lips cracked as if mid-prayer. The official statement claimed natural causes, but nothing about Don Carlos's life had been natural, and his death least of all. The body was buried quickly, without ceremony, the truth covered by protocol and the silence of power. In Europe, rumors spread. Was he poisoned? Was he starved? Had his own father signed his death away out of fear, embarrassment, or cold political necessity? The answers remain locked behind royal doors, lost to time. What makes Don Carlos's story so chilling is not just that he died, but that he was erased, forgotten while still alive, reduced to whispers while the Spanish Empire flourished. He was the crown prince of the most powerful monarchy in the world, yet his end came not on the battlefield, or in a grand hall, but in the silence of a sealed room. The boy who might have ruled an empire was instead consumed by it. This was not the tragedy of a failed king, but of a son never given a chance to live or heal, of a mind misunderstood, and a soul trapped in a world that feared weakness. Carlos was not just a figure in dusty history books. He was a living, breathing human who suffered behind walls built to display power, not compassion. His screams unheard, his letters unanswered, his fate sealed not by his sins but by his birth. And yet even in death his name endures, not in celebration but in sorrow. In the next part, we will explore what happened after his death, how his memory was reshaped by legend, art, and fear, and how a single locked door changed the destiny of a dynasty forever. When Don Carlos died in that sealed room in July 1568, the echoes of his suffering didn't stop with him. In fact, they began to grow louder, whispered not in the stone corridors of the Spanish palace but across the entire European continent. His story became legend, a tale of royal cruelty, hidden madness, and betrayal that no crown could fully silence. Some claimed he had been poisoned by order of his own father, King Philip II. Others believed he was simply starved to death as a slow punishment for crimes he never got to confess. But what disturbed people most was not how he died. It was how he disappeared, a crown prince buried with no public mourning, no procession, no monument. Just silence. The Spanish court tried to move on, presenting a calm exterior to the world, but behind closed doors, the damage had already been done. Diplomats from France, the Netherlands, and Italy began to question the official narrative. Elizabeth of Valois, the queen, and Carlos, his former fiancé, was said to be devastated. Rumors circulated that she had visited him in secret, cried for him, and even defied the king to beg for mercy. But these stories too were buried in the shadows after her own early death. Just 2 years later, artists, poets, and playwrights began to resurrect Carlos, not as the troubled boy he truly was, but as a tragic martyr. In the opera world, he became the central figure in Giuseppe Verdi's Don Carlo, a doomed romantic hero torn between love, duty, and tyranny. In that version, Carlos is a symbol of freedom, oppressed by an authoritarian father, a young man willing to die for justice and peace. Whether or not this romanticized version holds any truth is still debated, but it shows how powerful his death became in the public imagination. In some ways, Carlos lived longer in death than he ever did in life. But behind the myths lies a more uncomfortable truth. A teenager born into unimaginable pressure, crushed by the expectations of an empire, and failed by those who should have protected him. His illness, likely neurological or genetic, went untreated, unacknowledged, instead labeled as dangerous, sinful, or embarrassing. In the 16th century, mental health had no name. No compassion was offered to those who could not conform to royal decorum. Carlos was not a monster, but a boy in pain, a boy whose screams for help were seen as threats, whose tears were dismissed as disobedience, whose mind was seen as broken instead of wounded. His death was not just the end of a life, but a warning of what happens when power chooses silence over understanding. In the years that followed, King Philip II never spoke publicly about his son again. He focused on expanding the Spanish Empire, on defending Catholicism, on building monuments like El Escorial, but never did he build one for Carlos. Some historians argue that Philip acted out of necessity, that Carlos truly posed a threat to national stability and had to be removed. Others believe the king was haunted by guilt, that the weight of locking away his own child left a mark deeper than any sword could. Infants were born and named Carlos in royal circles across Europe, but none carried the same shadow. None bore the burden of a boy who lived behind locked doors. The chamber where Don Carlos died has gone lost to renovations, time, and royal indifference, but his story remains carved into the conscience of history. Spain's golden age shined brightly, but in its corners there were cracks, and in one of those cracks a prince was buried, not in soil but in silence. Today, when people walk through the museums of Madrid or study the great dynasties of Europe, they often overlook Carlos. He has no grand statue, no great battle to his name. But in opera halls and literature and quiet documentaries played late at night, he returns. Not as a ruler, but as a question, a haunting echo that asks, what if someone had listened? What if someone had believed him, comforted him, treated his illness instead of fearing it? What if instead of being locked away, Don Carlos had been set free? Could he have become a different man, a different kind of king? Could history have bent in a gentler direction? We will never know, but his story lingers for a reason. It reminds us that power can be merciless, that silence can kill, and that even within a palace a child can be utterly alone. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of the boy who stared at stone walls and whispered prayers into emptiness. Think of the heir who died not because he was evil, but because he was misunderstood. And let his memory not fade like candlelight, but burn softly as a warning and a sorrow for Don. Carlos, locked away and left to rot, is not just a ghost of the past. He is a mirror held up to power, a reflection of what it means to suffer unseen, and a voice that, though silent, still echoes through history with the quiet ache of all those who were lost before they could be saved.